So hopefully everyone's had a chance to join now. So I'll start the meeting. So good morning. Thank you so much for joining this meeting to present work on the path to net zero. It's part of, as you know, I suspect, a sequence of events. And this has the focus of individual action required to make a reality of the sixth carbon budget. It simply won't be possible to get to net zero by 2050 without engaging with people in a range of ways. 40% of the actions identified in the sixth carbon budget plans involve the engagement of consumers in some way or other. And some involve large-scale changes to electric cars, installing heat pumps instead of gas boilers, and many other changes, about 15% in total, are about day-to-day changes in behaviour. Things like just changing to more plant-based diets, reducing aviation growth, and choosing products that last longer and therefore need to be replaced less frequently, reducing use of resources. So over the next hour or so, we'll look at a variety of perspectives on the importance of behavioural change. I want to say a little bit about what we're going to cover. First, I'm going to give 5 minutes, no more, on a paper that I wrote for the committee, Net Zero After COVID. So picking up particularly on what COVID, how the recovery from COVID can feed into the thinking about building back better. Then we're going to hear from Eva Kmetovic and Rachel Hay from the CCC secretariat, and they're going to be giving a presentation on individual action in the sixth carbon budget. And then we're going to hear from Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, who's professor at the University of Bath and director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, CAST. And Lorraine's going to be talking to us about the behavioural aspect of the Climate Assembly deliberations. Then we're going to move into a Q&A. We're going to aim to leave plenty of time for Q&A, hopefully 20 minutes or perhaps a little more. And we're also aiming to keep our answers really snappy. So do ask as many questions as you like, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Okay, so next slide, please. I'm going to kick off by a few minutes and no more on a paper that I put together to inform the CCC sixth carbon budget work on behavioural principles, particularly, as I said, with reference to recovery from COVID. So next slide. So of course, COVID-induced changes to society have been massive, and some have been, as it happens, positive from a greenhouse gas perspective, not from many others, but not all. So clearly we've had a major transition to home and flexible working, which we might expect might be maintained. Certainly we've had reduced business travel, in fact, reduced travel of all kinds. We might be seeing, if some of these changes are embed, changes to the economic geography of both the UK and the world. Obviously, there's been a shift to digital. Lots of things which involve physical movement of people and goods have shifted to involving digital interactions, which obviously has potentially quite major implications. Another more concrete one, which many of us are very familiar with, is the shift to home delivery from high street shopping. That's part of the digital transformation. Now things are coming to us. Is that actually a positive thing? Can it be made to be a positive thing from a net zero point of view? That's obviously an interesting open question. As I say, some of these may reduce greenhouse emissions, others may not necessarily. And an interesting challenge for us, a very important challenge, is how can a crisis help us build back better and build back greener? Next slide, please. I want to focus very briefly on three principles that inform some of our thinking on how these transformations due to COVID can potentially embed and have an impact on our longer term carbon reduction. The power law of practice, the mind is a comparison machine, and renegotiating the social contract. So the first one's about how we get better when we do things more. The second is about how we adapt. And the third is about how we decide how to interact together, how we agree new ways of behaving. So quickly, each of those in turn. Next slide, please. The power law of practice is one of the most robust generalizations in psychology and indeed beyond psychology. So If you look at the speed with which people roll cigars over a lifetime of cigar rolling in a Havana cigar factory, you find that they just get quicker and quicker in a steady way. And in fact, if you plot their behavior on the old log paper we might remember from school, you get a fairly straight line. A famous psychological observation was that this tends to be a straight line. So as you get more practice, you get quicker and quicker and quicker, even for something as repetitive and simple as apparently cigar rolling is. Similarly with arithmetic, second example there. Oh, sorry, not the next slide, please, quite yet. But equally, with these are psychological tasks, but the same patterns arise for technology, and this is true for across all sectors. But solar panels on the bottom left, and in fact across many industries, you see the same thing. The more units, the more times you do something, the quicker, the cheaper, the faster things get. So that will be true, of course, for the behaviours that we've engaged in switching to digital working, for example, in the COVID. All of these things are going to get easier and quicker for us. Next slide, please. The crucial point too is that when we make big changes in our lives, we might imagine that this would be awfully difficult for us to do. And the reason we think it's going to be very difficult is we compare the future life to our current life and think, wow, that's going to be very hard. It's not like the life I'm leading now. And I want to stress that indeed the mind is very interested in comparisons, but that allows us some hope that we can, by changing the comparisons we care about, we can actually adapt much quicker than we think. So on the left-hand side, you have a picture of what is actually a perfectly uniform grey bar, but it looks very dark at one end and light at the other, and that's because the background is changing. When you're comparing a bit of grey to a light patch, it looks dark. When you're comparing it to a blackish patch, it looks light. And that's a very general fact about human behaviour. As, for example, we all get richer as time goes by, so this is a graph, I think, from US data, as people get richer, their life satisfaction, in fact, is remarkably stable. It's the same problem that, or the same phenomenon, that your comparison is continually shifting. But that also means, so as everybody, including yourself, gets better off, you think, well, I'm just sort of about the same as everybody else. I'm equally happy with where I am. But that means that when we're changing our behaviors radically, for example, we're working from home more or we're traveling less, we can actually adapt often much faster than we expect. And similarly with things like climate changes of diet and other behaviors. So we imagine that how things are now is how we always want them to be, but actually we are remarkably adaptable. Next slide, please. And the final point I want to make is that we can renegotiate the rules by which we live extremely quickly. It's very natural for us to think that we have a particular way of living and it could be the only way. So if we're going to have, if business people want to have meetings, they have to meet in person, they have to fly across the globe to do it. We found that there are alternatives and we're using one now. And I think our ability as individuals and groups of individuals and as a society to shift our social norms by common consent is remarkably impressive. Final slide, please. So just to summarize briefly, the challenge of building back greener is absolutely urgent. I think there are 3 principles, and clearly there are more that can help guide us. We have to remember, we've been practicing lots of new behaviors. If they're greener behaviors, we want to encourage those. We want to see how much better we're getting at doing things in a new, more efficient, perhaps digital way, and we want to build on that. We don't want to lose it. We want to recognize that doing things differently, living differently, can actually be something we can adapt to quite quickly. And we also should note, and this COVID has been a tremendous example of this, that we can renegotiate how to live with common consent and common will, and we can do it pretty quickly. And that's something that gives us some hope in the context of net zero. So I now want, next slide, please. I now want to hand over to Ava and Rachel, who are going to give us a presentation on the 6 carbon budget overview work that the CCC has done.
Thanks very much, Nick, and hi everyone and welcome. We've got a few slides to take you through today, and I'll be kicking off with the economy-wide charts from the 6 carbon budgets, and then I'll go through the behavioural aspects of our analysis in surface transport and the land use sectors, and then Rachel will round up on residential buildings. Next slide, please, Rachel. So this is a quote that I got from the Sixth Carbon Budget report, and I pulled it out because I thought it really encapsulated the need to put people at the heart of the transition to net zero. If we think it's all about technology, we're going to fail, not just because we're ignoring the massive contribution that people can play, but also because we're losing the opportunity to take them on this journey with us, to harness their enthusiasm, and to make sure that the path is underpinned by fairness and consensus. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of the key charts from our report, which sets out the actions that we need to take to meet the Sixth Carbon Budget trajectory on the path to net zero. And just a quick reminder of the key headline message from our report was that emissions need to reduce by 78% by 2035. And that's a big step up from our previous target, which essentially has been pushed forward by 15 years. The chart shows what's needed to get to net zero across 4 different areas. And starting from the top, the first thing you need to do is to reduce demand for the most carbon intensive activities. Instead of driving, you can walk or cycle, you can cut meat consumption, and you can fly a bit less. Energy efficiency is also really important, not just for buildings, but for car efficiency and resource efficiency across the economy as a whole. And that gets you the first 2 blocks of this chart. But the biggest single thing that gets you there is electrification, and that's shown in the orange wedge. We need electric vehicles in place of internal combustion vehicles, heat pumps instead of gas boilers. We also need other forms of low carbon energy that isn't electricity, so hydrogen and bioenergy with CCS can play part of this story. The third block is about decarbonising the electricity we have today, which, although is over 50% low carbon, we need to fully decarbonise by around 2035. And the last wedge you can see there in green is around carbon storage solutions. And these are a mixture of nature-based solutions such as afforestation and engineered greenhouse gas removal such as direct air capture. So this really gives you a flavour of the role of individuals in that transition, but the next chart quantifies this a little bit further. Next chart, please. So Nick mentioned a little bit about the importance of behaviour change in our Sixth Carbon Budget, and this really sort of sets that story out. The purple slice of this pie chart, which represents about 40% of abatement, we think can be delivered by low carbon technologies or fuels, and but without moving behaviour towards any other technologies. So this tends to be things that people don't notice directly. They can carry on using much the same equipment and technology as before, but the rest of it, around 60%, involves some element of change to behaviour. The orange wedge is pure behaviour change, or where the majority of that abatement is around behaviour change, such as a change in diets. And the rest of it, the pink wedge, is where people are bringing together technology and behaviour to cut emissions. So this is things like plugging in your car rather than filling it up at the petrol station. And it's clear that we need to engage people really closely with these changes we're setting out, and to start a conversation with them on how they perceive these changes and how best we can deliver those. Next slide, please, Rachel. So now I'm going to take a closer look at our analysis in surface transport. Next slide, please. So for surface transport overall in our balanced pathway, emissions need to reduce by about 70% by 2035 on 1990 levels and reach nearly zero emissions by 2050. And what's striking about this chart is that we need much more people engagement than in the economy as a whole. Nearly 95% of emissions reduction rely solely on people changing the way they do things, compared with the 60% that we've just seen. And the next few slides unpick these elements a bit further. Next slide, please. So this shows our ambition for demand reduction for cars, which requires a 17% reduction in miles driven by 2050 relative to business as usual. We looked at evidence on 3 drivers of this. One was societal changes and changes in technology that might stimulate behaviour change. So this is things like increased home the use of technology and IT, and continued trends in internet shopping and e-commerce. And this element of demand reduction targets mainly commuting and business trips and builds on evidence from what we found under COVID. And it's really important, as Nick pointed out, to lock in these positive behaviours that we've seen going forward. The second element is moving from cars to more sustainable transport modes like walking, cycling and use of public transport. And while walking trips have increased in recent years, cycling have been relatively flat and bus trips have declined. So we really need to address this. In our pathway, we have an 8% of reduction in car miles coming from this shift, but actually it represents a much bigger fraction of trips, about 27%, because the shorter trips are the easier ones to switch. And the third element here is about increasing car occupancy, so increasing efficiency of how we use our car in effect. And this can be achieved through things like car and ride sharing, which we've started to see happen through the various apps now available, and increasing car club schemes. And all of these require significant changes in people's behaviour compared to what we see now. So next slide, please, Rachel. And similarly for the van and HGV sector, we looked at how demand here could be reduced. For vans, we focus on the parcel delivery sector because that's where there's more evidence on the potential to do things a little bit differently. And here we've highlighted things like e-cargo bikes for last mile deliveries, the use of urban consolidation centres, telematics for directing to precise delivery locations. And we think that can deliver around a 3% reduction in van miles by 2030. For HGVs, we based our analysis on a study that Cambridge University did for us a few years ago. And they looked at measures such as improved routing through telematics, increased loading, reduced empty running, as well as industry collaboration through consolidation centres. And we think we can achieve around an 8% reduction in vehicle freight demand by 2050. Now, you might say, why focus on demand reduction where everything's going to be decarbonised anyway? But, we've identified important benefits of this, for example, for health, air quality, noise, and just making the environment and better places to live and work in. Okay, Rachel. The final element of behaviour change that I wanted to tell you about in surface transport, probably quite obvious, is the take-up of zero-emission vehicles, which is shown in this chart for cars and HGVs. And this requires drivers to get used to the new technology and overcoming things like range and charging anxiety. So perhaps not as drastic as the changes that we've just mentioned, but changes that people need to get used to nevertheless. And this needs to happen really quickly. Electric vehicles have been a long time in the making, but even now they just represent about 5% of all new car sales. And this needs to rise to 100% by 2032 in our balanced pathway. So that rapid transition over the next few years needs to reach out not just to the innovators and early adopters, but to mass market. And the zero carbon market for heavy goods vehicles is well behind that of cars. And there are three main options currently on trials around the world. These cover hydrogen, battery electric with ultra-fast chargers, and battery electric with catenary system. And our balanced pathway has a mix of these. And what we've recommended in our report is that we have large-scale demonstrations in the next few years to identify which of those options works best in the UK context. And then they'll start to be taken up in the late 2020s, reaching nearly 100% of sales by 2040. And this is a big ask for the sector, for the individual drivers, as well as for manufacturers. They need to get used to the new technology, work out how best it fits with their business model, and crucially, their delivery model. Okay, Rachel, thanks. Move on to the next one. So we're just going to go through the key elements of our scenarios for agriculture and land now. Next one, Rachel. So in this sector, all of the abatement we identify requires some sort of behaviour change. So that's a pretty, drastic thing to be asking of this sector. And it really requires, a drastic way in which land is used in order to meet our climate target. It really means raising agricultural productivity so we can grow more with less, and using that land feed up to actively restore habitats. Our analysis shows that we can still maintain current per capita food production by using land more efficiently and changing what we produce. And the chart on the right sets out the key changes in land from now and in 2050, and shows that increased afforestation, peatland restoration, use of bioenergy crops, and growing trees on farms. And achieving this requires concerted action on the part of both consumers of food and land managers. And the next couple of slides illustrate this a bit more. So in terms of actions on the part of consumers, there are two essential aspects of this: diet change and reducing food waste. We've mentioned diet change quite a lot already, and that's because it's the single most important factor that we can do to release land from agriculture and to enable land to be used for nature-based solutions. And this is because meat and dairy are the most carbon-intensive protein sources, but they're also inefficient ways to use land. Our scenarios that we've developed for our report reduce consumptions of these high carbon foods by 20 to 50% on current levels. And whilst we've seen trends towards vegetarian and flexitarian diets, these needs to be ramped up. It requires consumers to engage with this debate and for supermarkets and producers to create and offer more plant-based options. In terms of food waste, we currently waste around a third of all food consumed in the UK, which is a massive waste of resources. And our scenarios assume that these can be cut by 50 to 70% on 2007 levels by 2050. So this is perhaps even more difficult for consumers to achieve. They have to be thinking about what they buy, how they store food, but also it requires food supplies and technology to help in that process in order to achieve this. Okay, Rachel, so the final slide I've got for you is just to give you a flavour of the different actions that we're asking farmers and land owners to do things differently. So we need, in order to meet our climate goals. So we need farmers to implement a range of low carbon farming practices covering crops and soils, livestock diets and breeding. We need to significantly ramp up afforestation rates. We need to plant more energy crops to around 0.7 million hectares by 2050. We need to restore most of peatlands or sustainably manage them. And we need to use agroforestry on around 10% of existing agricultural land. None of this is easy. There are over 200,000 farms in the UK. Most of them are small. Farmers need to overcome a range of barriers. It's not just about costs, but also about acquiring knowledge and skills in these new areas for them, getting our R&D on farm level, and scaling up the industries and supply chains. Okay, Rachel, hand over to you now. Thanks.
Hi there, thanks very much, Eva. So my name's Rachel Hay, and I'm a senior analyst on residential buildings decarbonisation at the CCC. I'm going to try and limit my discussion on residential buildings to around 5 minutes. So it's going to be very much a whistle-stop tour, but I'm going to first talk through the aggregate impact of behavioural measures in our scenarios before moving on to the actions that householders can take to drive down bills and emissions. So firstly, I think the key point to make in relation to changing our behaviour and reducing buildings emissions is that we do have potential to make a significant and immediate difference to our energy use and bills, and of course our carbon savings. So I'd like to demonstrate that by looking at this chart firstly of operating costs over time for existing homes in our balanced pathway. So operating costs essentially show how our fuel and maintenance costs change relative to a world where we don't do anything. And you can see that our balanced pathway is associated with about £3 billion worth of savings by 2050. And around 300 to 400 million of that comes from the actions we can take to reduce energy use in our homes. And those savings are kind of doubled in our most ambitious scenarios. So this is very much kind of a moderate view. What's really striking then, looking at our balanced pathway, is that behaviour change, even where it's moderate, has potential to make one of the biggest contributions to demand reduction and therefore to carbon and bill savings in the scenario. And yet it's very low cost or free to do. And it's also within all of our powers to act on now. So I think that raises the question then of what we can do. So here, essentially, what I'd like to talk through is the range of explicit behaviour change measures we've got across our scenarios. So the first one that we've got is preheating homes. So where homes are sufficiently well insulated and they've got, for instance, smart heating controls, it's possible to preheat ahead of peak times. And what we mean by that is that people can choose to heat their homes up to 4 hours ahead of when they need the warmth, such that it's effectively stored in the fabric of the building. And you can see from the diagram that this has the effect of moving consumption from the orange to the yellow areas, reducing peak demand. And that enables access to cheaper tariffs, which reflect the reduced costs associated with reducing power off peak, but also reducing requirements for network reinforcement. Secondly, managing our hot water use. So using, for instance, a low flow shower head could reduce hot water demand by around 5%. You can also get much greater savings by reducing the hot water temperature. So we've got one scenario where we reduce the hot water temperature from 60 to 50 degrees with an automated daily Legionella cycle built in. And that latter caveat is really critical to managing Legionella risk. We've then got smarter heating management and use. So we assume a 3 to 6% reduction in heat demand can be achieved. And at the lower end of that range, that means things like turning the thermostat down or reducing the times when it's on. And at the upper end, it's about having a multi-zone control system. So you might have different temperatures set for different rooms of the house, which you have a lot more control over. The next example is changing the way we buy heating. So the example I want to talk about here is heat as a service delivery models, which essentially involve consumers purchasing service bundles or outcomes from providers, such as a certain number of warm hours in place of kilowatt hours of fuel, which can essentially enable the same or better outcomes to be delivered in terms of warmth in your home, but it can do so more efficiently and potentially remove the worry for homeowners that might be nervous, particularly about new forms of heating. And finally, turning off lights. So we assume a 10% reduction in lighting use, leading to indirect emission savings in the scenario. And the final slide I want to come onto is essentially to acknowledge the fact that although we've got these explicit behaviour saving measures in our scenarios, there's an awful lot of behaviour change going on, which is implicit in the other measures that we've got, particularly in the use of new technologies and the way we use our homes. So what I've got here is a picture of a home that we had in our housing report, a low carbon home. And to take the first example, so some low carbon technologies such as heat pumps do operate a bit differently to other forms of heating. So some people might be used to using their gas heating by turning it on and off when they need it. Heat pumps operate most efficiently when the system's running as smoothly as possible. So rather than turning it on and off, it'd be better to use a thermostat to set the temperature that you want and when, and to allow the heat pump to operate to achieve it. And generally, heat pumps will run for longer than a traditional heating system might. Secondly, cooking. So if we're to deliver net zero, we've got to transition away from our use of gas. And that means not only moving away from gas boilers, but also gas cooking. And where an area has access to hydrogen in the gas grid, that could mean a hydrogen cooker, which might be very similar to use. But if you're in an area where there isn't hydrogen available, it might mean switching to electric, which may be a bit different. It's also really important to note that it's also about making sure our homes are comfortable, particularly in the context of a changing climate. So that's things like using shutters or closing our curtains during the day when it's very hot to stop sunlight entering and to minimise overheating risk in homes. And similarly, it's really important that we act to ventilate our homes properly. So opening windows at the right times, including kind of purge ventilation at night. And also if we've got mechanical systems like MVHR, remembering to change the filters. So that brings me to the end of the residential buildings section. And I'd like to hand over to Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh to go through the climate assembly slides.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Very nice to be here. And I will just spend 5 minutes giving a very quick introduction to Climate Assembly UK and some of the recommendations, particularly those that speak to behaviour change, though I would say actually the majority of them do. Next slide, please. So for those not familiar with citizens' assemblies, these are increasingly used by policymakers and governments as a way of understanding informed public preferences. So they go beyond things like surveys and polls, which we often use to get a bit of a sense of what the public think about different policies and issues, and provide information to the public and allow them to deliberate on that when, and then they come up with recommendations. Climate Assembly UK was the first UK-wide citizens' assembly on climate change, and it was commissioned by 6 select committees of the House of Commons to look at the question of how the UK should reach its legally binding target of net zero emissions by 2050. And it chose to use a citizens' assembly because, as we've already heard, there are going to be profound impacts on people's lifestyles, on their behaviour and decision-making of reaching net zero. So it's important to find out what they think about these changes and involve them in that decision making. Very briefly, there were 108 assembly members who were recruited through a rigorous process of sampling to ensure a representative sample of the UK population in terms of age, gender, income, geography, and levels of concern about climate change. And they met over 6 weekends in 2020 to learn about a range of issues to do with net zero, consider them and make some recommendations. Next slide, please. And so if you look at the report, it's a very long report, you'll see that we covered a whole range of issues around how to get to net zero. So really all the main sort of areas of policy. We started off by looking at principles, and then we moved on to travel, energy use in the home, consumption, energy supply, and so on. And I will, next slide please, give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that came out of those discussions and recommendations now. Next slide please. Just before I go into some concrete examples, I thought it would be useful to draw out some of the main themes that came out across all of those very diverse topics. And I would say that all of these themes say something about how we can design effective and acceptable behaviour change policies to reach net zero. So the first theme was really around fairness. This was something they defined themselves. This is about thinking about different levels of income, people working in different sectors, people in different regions and so on, and ensuring that certain groups are not unfairly disadvantaged by a transition to net zero. The second one is around making use of co-benefits of a transition to net zero. In other words, additional benefits for local high streets, the economy, one's health, biodiversity, and so on. So in other words, not only cutting emissions, but also making our lives better. Next, there was the importance of freedom and choice to be maintained as far as possible, but also linked to that, ensuring that we had much better information and education to inform our decision-making and consumers' decision-making to ensure that they were choosing lower carbon options. And very strong leadership from government was regularly emphasised as well, so that there was a feeling that consumers and individual citizens would be willing to act if they were a part of a collective action, that government, business and others were part of that collective action as well. Next slide, please. So I don't have time to go into lots of detail, but just to pick out a few examples of the sorts of behaviour change and wider policies that were supported. So for example, within surface travel, you can see that there was support for a future that didn't place too much restriction on how much we travel. There was support for localization, so building communities in ways that did reduce the amount of travel that we needed to make. but much stronger support for shifting to electric vehicles, so and by choosing those lower carbon vehicles, and also shifting to lower carbon modes of travel, public and active modes. To take another example on the what we eat and how we use the land, which is the one I was most closely involved with, there was a very strong support for reducing meat and dairy consumption within our diets that came out there, actually, as well as support for local production of food, support for farmers as well to make those transitions, those behaviour changes that we just heard about. And again, we see not disproportionately affecting the least well off coming out in a number of ways. Next slide, please. Maybe just to take one more example from the what we buy topic, here there was again support not only for changing what business do to ensure that products are lower carbon and producing using more efficient processes, but also to repair and share products more, so support for the sort of so-called circular economy. So there's significant behaviour changes required there, but again, the importance of information in informing that decision making to ensure we buy lower carbon products. Again, happy to talk in lots more examples and details in the discussion. I think next slide, please. But yeah, just to emphasize, I think that throughout the report, you'll see there are lots of behaviour changes, behaviour change policies that are given a lot of support. But what's really interesting, I think, is the conditions under which those policies are seen as more acceptable. And those conditions I mentioned already in terms of fairness, for example, showing strong leadership from government and business and so on. So I think there's a huge resource here to inform effective behaviour change policy making. Thanks.